We're starting this episode in 3, 2, 1. Concentrate.
Luck power.
All right, let me start this story with an admission to the audience how I kind of started this off on the wrong foot. I listened to the audio drama. Normally audiobooks are a great way, I think, to kind of take in stories. And I always like to read them. I didn't get around to reading it until just right before we recorded now. And that's when I realized, oh, crud, they changed a lot for the audio drama. Stories, just a lot of differences, I would say.
And that can make a big difference. I'm not trying to shame you. Secretly, I'm shaming you.
And on video, so publicly shaming.
No, I'm not publicly shaming you because I usually listen and then read afterwards the same. It can make a big difference in a Vonnegut story because I think details matter here.
I actually had some talking points that are now most assuredly different now that I've read the story.
They're moot.
So let's kick it off, right? The story is kind of phrased as a report with like this student that, you know, we jump around in time a little bit. Eventually we learn that he was going to get help on his thesis from this professor Barnhouse. And basically we have this world-shattering discovery that the professor has discovered this mental radiation that he calls dynamo-psychism something or other, and the press would call it the Barnhouse Effect, hence the name of the story. But it's basically about the mind as a weapon.
It's the first superhero. I feel like whoever created superheroes later in comics and things, they had to have read this story because it feels very reminiscent of almost giving power to one individual to try to alleviate the horrors of the world.
Well, comics have always been a way of reflecting the world. If you go back to a lot of like the Superman and like the early writings and such, like they clearly are discussing social events. Those things permeate into the morals and standard discussions that are happening. And in the same way, this Professor Barnhouse is kind of like radiating, okay, fine, pun intended, with the world, how this, you know, World War II is going on. And he's like, well, hey, wars are stupid. I could stop this, guys, right? And, you know, when he goes into hiding, like it kind of gives you a little snippet that, you know, they try to build things to jam his radiation or bunkers to hide from, and he just instantly flat him, which is to say that, you know, mind over matter, that the mind is more powerful than the pen or the atom bomb per se.
And I think it's important to note, if you haven't consumed a lot of Vonnegut's works, that he was in World War II. A lot of his books, stories, themes revolve around it. And I think that here he's going for, what if people stood up to war? Could it have made it a difference? Would it have made a difference at all?
Well, and ironically, does it do anything, right? Because like Vonnegut he always has that absurdist view of the world of, does it even matter, right? Because you see in the story how militaries and comrade, I can't even remember his name, but like they even reference the arms race of how now they're trying to weaponize this thing that was invented or created and could stop wars, well, not even stop wars, right? Like
prevent.
Make them irrelevant, not even prevent, but it's like, why have a war if you have everything you need, right? And you still have everyone that's like, well, no. It's not about resources. This is about power. This is about my status compared to the next person, which is even more, I think, deflating. And maybe why I like Vonnegut too, because I guess his pessimism reverberates through me in some way of I do see this in people.
And we have to remember, this came out in 1950, and the United States had the atomic weapons, had used atomic weapons twice against Japan. Mass, killing of innocent people for, quote, the greater good. And obviously that weighed on Vonnegut of, where is that line? And I think that with Barnhouse, he's trying to do the right thing of, this weapon, or if you weaponize me, it's going to do more harm than good. And there's a lot of philosophy and arguments to be made that while the atomic weapon did end the war quickly and maybe save lives then, what does it cost us now? What does the weaponization of power do to the future generations? And that's something that people sometimes don't think about. And did Oppenheimer and Einstein think about those things? I'm sure they did, but Vonnegut is really going to the heart and philosophy of, when it comes down to one person making that decision, it could, I think, make a difference. At least that's what I think.
No, I wouldn't disagree with you at all there, because I mean, even if you, again, I really like the audio drama, just to reference something in the audio drama that was not in the story, to be clear here. There was reference about how they were trying to create robots to replace the pilots in war. But the problem is the robots kept going mad. And they're like, all right, well, we need to fix what's going wrong with the robots. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. The human pilots go mad, the robots go mad. Has anyone thought that there's nothing wrong with the humans and robots? The problem is the war, right? Like, it's those subtle commentaries that you have to kind of ask yourself that are humorous, they're juvenile, and I think that turns off some people to Vonnegut's writing. But there's something honest about that too, about the absurdity and senselessness of war. When we talk about, him coming out of those Dresden bombings, and just to see the chaos, like it shook him to the core. And before I even read Vonnegut, I've always just been, I don't know why, I've had this irrational fear of, now I'm 42, so it never happened, but I had this fear of like us going to war. I had fears of being, conscripted into the army. My grandfather, he served in World War II, and actually he passed away. And there's talks about what happened with the things, after his death, like the memories, right? Because I guess when, that he served, he was actually in Japan. And when they were leaving, like, they were allowed to take a certain amount of things back. Like, he took a rifle, a Japanese rifle. And I guess, like, they were overweight. So he had to, like, throw the gun out. But he held on to the bayonet. Like, he took off the bayonet from the weapon. And that's what was kind of like, well, who's the bayonet going to, after my grandfather passed away? And it's kind of like the senselessness of the war. Like, why would you choose the enemy weapon? Is it a reminder? Is it something that you just thought was cool? Right? Like, it's that idea that humans can make a weapon and anything ridiculous. And I guess that's just kind of like why I like Vonnegut, is because he saw the senselessness, the ridiculousness of it. Why would you even want a souvenir? And there's a part of that commentary even in Slaughterhouse-Five. I'm sorry, I know I'm going on and off about a tangent, but the point being, Vonnegut saw senselessness in war and has these unique, absurdist ways of making them ridiculous, such as wondering what's wrong with the robots as opposed to what's wrong with going with war, to war.
I think there's two things we can kind of take out of this. That there is a materialization. The atomic weapon is literally a physical embodiment of death. And Barnhouse, his is mental. And to bring it back to what you kind of said at the beginning of this, is the pen is mightier than the sword. The mind over matter is, if people made better choices, could we overcome war? Because in Vonnegut's mind, from what I've read of all of his works, I think he believes that there's no justification for this. And he was on the side of the Allies, fighting to end, Nazism. And I think that the horrors that he saw broke his spirit, broke, who he was, and rightfully so. I mean, I couldn't imagine that. I've heard stories of, the Japanese internment camps, from my wife's grandfather, and the same thing of that. It's maybe it's a young man's thing. He didn't, take any souvenirs or anything because he was a prisoner of war, but it's tough, I think, on the psyche. And I think that's kind of the last element that Vonnegut loops in here is religion.
We'll say more. What do you mean by the religion part?
Well, it's almost this relationship that I feel like the religion and science here, that Barnhouse is almost like a Christ-like figure, a religious figure, a God with a little g, that he is the one and all, right? And as the story progresses, he's going to die. And then what happens? Everybody go, because he's destroyed all the weapons. But once he's gone, the people are all going to just rebuild the weapons and we're right back where we started. Like, there's going to be no progress made whatsoever. And I think that it's kind of like that line between, religion and science of how do we better ourselves? Do we better ourselves through one or the other? Or I think he was looking for is how do we better ourselves through a combination of both? Pass on the sins of the past, but also pass on how to make the future better. How do we give the future hope?
Okay. I did not have that religious lens when I was looking at it. But I could see that to me, it was kind of like this idea of choice too, because I think the professor meant well, right? Like he wanted to stop wars. When he's talking to General Barker, he's like, why do this? It costs the taxpayers nothing if I just create power the generators where there are no power, where if we were to bring water to a place where there's no clean water and such, like he had these humanitarian goals. And when is change and a thought enough to change a person, right? Well, it's not enough to change the general, right? Because he's like, well, put those thoughts aside. Look, I've been doing this for 20, 30 years or whatever, self-defense. Leave self-defense to me. I've got this down. And he's not even like open to changing that thought, the idea of improving in a sense. And then it comes back to the end. I think this is my other thought when it comes to choice is the barnhouse, like the person can die, right? And there's that mortality of like, oh, his family line only lives to 50. But the Barnhouse Effect, the quote in the story, lives on. That can't die, right? And he passed on those secret messages to his protege, who at the end rolls the 50 straight sevens or whatever it is. Like he basically realizes he has the new Barnhouse Effect. So if we are taking that leg that you were just kind of talking about, he is the new omniscient, omnipotent being that can cause ultimate destruction and has pure reign over people, except for their choice. He can't make the general make a different choice. He can only show them the options, but it's always up to that person to still make that choice, which I think is kind of interesting. And I guess does still play with your religious themes because, well, at least with Christianity, free will is obviously an element of that, right?
And the power being held in the possession of one person, a singularity. And I think that...
Well, and the search for that one person, right? Because everybody's searching. Does he even exist? He has to. We see his effects, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also the fact that it's almost the exploitation of power, the general and the government. And again, not anti-government. It just... What is... Typically, their role, if you look through history, is the exploitation of power. How can we use it to our benefit for our advancement? And we see that kind of again. And I don't know if Vonnegut was, anti-government, but he was definitely anti-war and wanted to find a way that how could we do away with such atrocities in the future?
Right. Like if you give everybody something that they need, would they go to war? And then the general replies with something along the lines of like eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. I think it is, which correct me if I'm wrong. That's like I tried to look up the reference. I thought it was a Thomas Jefferson. I could have sworn it was, but when I started looking it up, they're like, well, he might have been referencing this old Irish individual that referenced it years ago. But that's clearly a line that we're supposed to take because it's from our world and real world, like eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. I think we're supposed to digest, what does that mean?
Yeah, I don't know. What does that mean? Because I think in the realm of like our history, not in the story, but Vonnegut saw tens of thousands of people being sacrificed for that. And is it worth it in the end?
Yeah, it's to me, it's a little bit of the Sisyphus, story of Sisyphus, the guy that was doomed to eternally push the rock up the mountain or hill or whatever, and then the rock would just fall back down, and then his duty was to push that rock back up again. It's the, again, absurdist idea of like, what's the point of all of this all? Well, to me, the eternal vigilance is like that constant struggle for the weapon to end war, when all you're doing is, by kind of what these people are doing at the end, you're constantly chasing violence. You're constantly chasing the ultimate weapon, the arms race, because as long as you have the next potential weapon, people aren't going to attack you. So it's that eternal search, that eternal vigilance of self-defense, almost in a sense, is what keeps the peace in a very dark way, is kind of how I interpreted it.
Definitely a dark way, for sure. I think that Barnhouse, if everybody had what their needs met, if everybody had shelter, food, love, everything taken care of, what would there be left to fight over? If everybody had everything they needed, what happens then?
And I think the argument is everybody wants different things, right? So how can you have enough of everything? And again, to which I would reply with another Vonnegut quote. I think it's from the Sirens of Titan, You know it. I love this quote where he says the universe is an awfully big place for a lot of people to be right. Right? We might all have different needs and different standards, but there is a lot of this universe in which we can be right and not necessarily have to have our righteousness or whatever we want to call it inflicted upon others. And I think that's, I don't know, that for some reason that's just something that's stuck with me. There's something honest about that I think, sometimes we can get caught up being a little bit too tied up in some specificities that if we just took some time off, some steps back, a change of location, I think we realize some things aren't as big of deals as we think they are. And I don't know, there's something about the can't we all just get along thing that just it comes out of me, even though I know it can't be true because we're humans.
I mean, it's naive, and I love it. I wish it were true, and I'm not trying to insult anybody because I felt that way when I was younger, but it is a very naive way of thinking because humans are destructive, animals are destructive, the planet's destructive, and since we came out of caves or came out of the jungle, we've always found ways to kill ourselves and kill ourselves more efficiently and better, which is sad. And not to say that we're evil, I just think it's a part of nature, destruction and creation. It takes both. There's light and dark to everything.
All right, so my final question, let's say the Barnhouse Effect is created and it's put in the hands of a truly peaceful man who can disappear. Could he stop violence and war with his invisible hand to basically crush anyone that tries to step out of line?
Temporarily, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you could instill fear. It probably comes back to kind of the idea of like Superman. You could rule with an iron fist and fear, or you could save and try to inspire hope for people to do better on their own.
And I think as long as we have that person ruling through fear, there will always, it's the rule, the Sith, the rule of two. There's always someone to crave it and misuse it,
and
right?
covet it.
Yeah,
covet
it's the
arms
power.
Race.
It's the arms race. We will always have to pay that eternal vigilance price for the quote unquote freedom, whatever that freedom is for you. So I'll let you guys tell me what you think the main thrust of this story was. Were we way off? Did you want to bring some other other elements that we didn't discuss? Let us know in the comments down below. Playlist of other Kurt Vonnegut talks down below. Looking forward to checking out more of his stuff. He's one of my favorite writers. My name's been Una. Peace.
Peace.